evening, everyone. Welcome to the Leadership Podcast. This is our episode 15, I believe, is what we're on. Tonight, we're going to be talking about humanitarian aid for other countries. I am your host for this evening, Brett Miller. I'm here with our other co-hosts, Dion Dixon, Will Atkins, and Thea Ali. This is the podcast where we get to have, hopefully, civil discussions, right? Where we can argue through some topics, and hopefully our disagreements lead to helping you with your decisions and how you approach politics. We're really here because we want to help you guys think differently about politics. We want to provide a platform where we can talk through things and not scream at each other and actually have cool, level-headed conversations so that you can come to logical conclusions about why you think the way you think. So, like I said, we're talking about humanitarian aid tonight towards other countries. I know last week we had talked about domestic aid and how that played into specifically blanking on words here at the moment. Disaster
emergency response.
Yeah, emergency responses, actually. So we're going to talk a broader topic now. We're going to talk about outside the walls of the country. Will, I'm going to toss it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. So when we're having this discussion about foreign aid for other countries, more than likely our discussion may center around USAID and the aid that they provide to other countries. But it's important to remember that there's all different kinds of foreign aid. And whether you're talking about those other kinds, the military training missions that we do, whether it's actually the kind of the development aid that we provide, to be honest, I don't know that I've heard any senior military person say otherwise, perhaps other than the current SecDef. But this kind of international aid helps us to avoid wars. It helps other countries stay out of prevent their own kind of internal conflict. When people are starving, then people rise up to try to find some food or steal food from other people. And so in general, in fact, I think, was it Mad Dog, I think, had a quote that's like, if I had $1 more to spend on defense, I would give it to state for international aid or something like that, that those were like the best dollars that could be spent to keep America safe, above and beyond what we're already spending on our defense would go towards international aid. So that's kind of
who Mad Dog is, because not everybody knows that nickname.
Mad Dog Mattis. Previous Secretary of Defense, 4-star general, Marine, and overall badass.
I think he's more famous for his quote about be friendly, but have a plan to kill everybody in the room. Something like that.
Yeah, that's a good one.
That's very Batman-ish.
When 4-star generals and SecDefs, previous SecDefs are saying, like, if I had another dollar, I would put it into international aid. And these are the folks that are tasked with keeping us safe. That's kind of the position that I take on it as well, that we've already got arguably the biggest, baddest, awesomest Air Force, Marine, Army, the best military in the world. And the way that we use such a minuscule amount of money, by the way, I do want to highlight that less than 1% of our GDP is what we're talking about here, that goes into foreign aid. That is a 1% that's well spent.
So, Will, I will throw out there to challenge your, if I had another dollar to spend.
Yeah.
What if you not only don't have another dollar to spend, but you are so far in debt that you have negative thousands of dollars to spend, as in you've already way overspent your budget?
Yeah. So, and I mean, that's a valid point, right? There's limited dollars to go around, and yet somehow we always find a way to pay the military and to usually increase its budget. But I would argue, though, that the very small amounts that we're putting towards international aid are minuscule compared to the, trillions that we pay when we go to war. And if we could avoid those wars and not have to spend those trillions by spending a couple of billion on international aid, that that is still net positive in our budgets. Although I take your point that we're running these deficits, but getting rid of this 1% of international aid is nowhere near enough to fix, the $4 trillion that Trump's about to give in tax breaks, So it's not, yes, I take your point that there's limited dollars, but this isn't, even zeroing it out would never solve our fiscal issues.
I think the thing that I struggled with when we were talking about when we, to come in to have this conversation in the podcast was I suspected and I feared that our conversation would devolve into whether it's worth spending the money. And I think that is secondary to like, who do we want to be as a country? Who do we see ourselves as a nation when it comes to, we talked about this a little bit when we talked about our role in world insecurity from a security standpoint, but I guess I would like us to engage with the humanitarian aspect of it, right? So you have like organizations we've pulled out of the World Health Organization, we're defunding USAID, we're, saying, speaking against being part of the NATO alliance, which I know is a defense alliance, but it also goes hand in hand with the UN, which also does a lot of humanitarian work. And the question is when things are happening, when there's a famine, when Ebola is breaking out in parts of the world, where things are happening, where there's devastation, we have the ability to help. Is our stance, sucks to be them, we're good, sucks to be them. And that's what it feels like. And I can make a million arguments of why we benefit from involving ourselves in a lot of these issues. I think one of the main ones when you talk about health is, the interest in keeping Ebola from spreading in a country in Africa is that eventually that Ebola gets on a plane and comes to America. And it's a lot easier to contain it when it starts than to wait for it to become a full-blown outbreak and end up here. We benefit from AIDS and HIV and AIDS not going back to the state that it was in the 90s, right? And you don't want this drug resistant virus spreading all over Africa because eventually it comes to the US. So that's like the pessimistic we're looking out for ourselves. But again, there's a human cost, and I always hear people say, well, we shouldn't be helping people in other parts of the world when we can't help ourselves. And I just refuse to believe that it's mutually exclusive. And I don't believe that's true.
I think we had this discussion a few episodes ago, didn't we?
Yeah. And it's just never been proven that we can't help ourselves. And that's where it does go to the money aspect, right? We're saying we're spending less than 1%, right? So the idea that the reason we aren't addressing domestic issues is because we're doing so much overseas has never been true. And again, like we said, we've talked dollars, the money we're spending overseas more or less tends to be on the defense side, not on the humanitarian aid side. So again, that's a long way of me saying, are we just okay with sitting by and watching when these bad things happen and not having a plan? Brett last week talked about being prepared, right? And helping, anticipating when things are coming and getting ahead of it, not just waiting to be responding. And some of these vaccine programs and a lot of these things that we were doing was a way to prepare or prevent things from happening and then having to be in a responsive position. So are we just saying we're okay? Bad things happen around the world. It's not our fault. Other people should take responsibility for themselves. And America, we shouldn't get involved. It's a real question. It's not a rhetorical question.
So Thea and Will, I want to push back on a couple of things that you guys said, just to play devil's advocate and So one of the things is, Will, you said humanitarian aid helps keep us out of wars. Of course, we are engaged in conflict, as the four of us know, and probably the rest of the country is maybe hopefully becoming more aware of. It wasn't just Afghanistan and Iraq. Like we have been in conflict hot zones all over the world, but continuously, right? So I think before we started recording, you were saying it's hard to prove a negative, and I take your point there, right? Maybe it would be double or triple as bad if we weren't doing these humanitarian aid things. But but it certainly hasn't kept us out of conflict, right? And it has been costing a lot of American lives and treasure. So there's that. And Thea, to your point about Ebola, well, thankfully, Ebola has not made it to the shores of the United States, but COVID certainly did, right? And so there's another one where it's like, well, okay, and then I don't want this
What's your
to
point
become a
there? What's your
discussion.
point? What I actually want to know what point you're trying to make. Are you trying to say because we succeeded in one area but we failed, we shouldn't do it at all? Because I'm trying to understand what point you're making and giving the example of COVID.
It's kind of similar to the point that I made when we were talking about the Department of Education, which is we're not talking about a tremendous amount of money, but I mean, we are talking about $80 billion in fiscal year 2023, which is the last year that we have data for. And so, I mean, it's not exactly chump change. I know in our government's budget, it kind of is, but it's still like $80 billion. And so are we getting the value for money out of that $80 billion? And Thea, I know you said you didn't want to come down to dollars. It comes down to what kind of country we want to be. I'm going to be the long-term strategic pessimist here, and I'm going to say we cannot keep going at a $2 trillion deficit a year and continue racking up national debt, because eventually we are going to become a fiscal liability instead of a fiscal resource for the rest of the world. And so what happens if we continue on this path and we become unsustainable and the rest of the world can't rely on us for that aid that we supply?
I'll give you, Dion, I'll give you this argument. And I think I've given this before in previous discussions. I'm not saying that we don't have to, that as the United States, we wouldn't benefit from, and nor that we shouldn't look at our spending and look at, our long-term fiscal health as a country. But I think we've all agreed the big ticket items that are going to get us there are things like Social Security, Medicare. Even if you start talking about government programs, you're talking defense spending. And so where I struggle with is when we're literally focusing on the smallest fractions and saying this is the thing that's keeping, that our fiscal health long term is the reason why we need to cut these programs, when we know we could cut all of them and it wouldn't even be a drop in the bucket towards our deficit. And the things that we really need to be addressing, we're not addressing yet. And so that's where it's like it falls on deaf ears to me when we make the fist. That's why I'm like, I don't want to just have an argument about money, because even if we get rid of all of our humanitarian work around the world, we are in the same financial situation that we would be in otherwise. It makes no difference. Like when we have an argument about Social Security, then you make the argument you're making is a great argument with Social Security, where then it's like, we are paying for it and it makes a huge difference. But when you're making that argument about something that we're spending such a small fraction, it's harder to swallow. You see what I'm saying?
I do see what you're saying, and I take that point, but I would say, I hear a lot of people say, oh, we're, USAID, right? And I don't want to get into a discussion about that, because what I want to focus on in this topic where we're talking about foreign aid is I want to talk about the type of foreign aid that a rational person would agree is useful and beneficial to the people receiving the aid, rather than, a lot of the programs that USAID is supposedly funding have been controversial to a lot of people. And I don't want to get into discussion about that kind of thing. I want us all to assume, for the purposes of this discussion, that we're talking about genuine aid that a rational person would perceive as beneficial and useful to the people receiving that aid. So sorry, where was I going with that? Oh, right. So if you have a friend who is having trouble paying their $2,000 a month rent, right? Which that's probably cheap for where Thea lives, and actually where I live, but I don't know where Brett and Will are. Maybe that's reasonable, but your friend can't pay their $2,000 rent, but they go out for a latte every morning. Now that $5 latte really is a drop in the bucket compared to their $2,000 rent. But if you don't start looking for all of those things where it's like, hey, this is something that you are spending money on, that as we prioritize needs for you, this is low on the priority list, you could take this out and you would be okay. Like, I feel like a lot of those things that we talk about are like are small change items, they all add up to things that we could say, hey, we could make a meaningful difference if we look at all of these things, we prioritize it, rack and stack it, and go, you know what? We as a nation think that this should move to the bottom of the list. And of course,
Well,
Gia,
I guess
you said you don't think
so
it should
I
move
guess,
to the bottom of the list.
no, I'm asking you, are you answering my question? Then yes, then we are the kind of, because my question was, is this who we want to be? Is this, we're the country that says sucks to be you? And
Well,
that's, I hear you saying yes.
So I've got a
Dan,
point to kind of make on that, because you guys are talking about like, if we end the aid, then it's ended forever. And that's not really the case, because, you know, to Dion's point, like one of the things I do is I coach people in their finances and how to budget stuff. So if you look at it from a personal finance standpoint, Dion's right. You look at your big ticket items first, you find ways to reduce those if you can, but then all the little stuff, the subscriptions to TV programs, to you're stopping to get a latte, all these little things that are there right now, you might deem them as unnecessary. But then once you get your budget in order and straightened out, and especially if you can add income to what you're currently doing, then you can add things back in as they become beneficial, right? So it's not like, hey, if we cut aid, we're never going to do aid again. But there might be a time frame where, you know what, we do have to tighten it up. And then we can come back and approach to, like Dion's point is, okay, what aid are we giving? How are we giving it? And to what standpoint? Because to me, if we're giving aid out, then I mean, because a lot of the things that are coming to light these days, like Dion's point, is that there's stuff that we've been funding that I don't think that most of the American public agrees with. And so if we're going to be that way, we should be transparent about it. There should be accountable. And then any aid that we give should be a results-oriented aid. You know, I personally think that if the U.S. government is giving aid, it should be backed by U.S. interests, right? If you've got a pet project that you love and that you want to give to, well, guess what? That's what charitable donations are for, and other private sector companies can do, that you can take your personal money and give to that. But if it's the U.S. government, I do think that should be a very targeted thing, because I do agree with Will that, yes, aid is a good thing. We should help our allies. We should help the world. And yes, as the type of people we want to be, I'm all for being the good neighbor, but it still has to be responsible.
Okay, so let's look at PEPFAR, right? So PEPFAR is the emergency plan. So it was officially called the United States President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, right? Yep. And so that's the program that is where we're talking about, you know, how they were providing a lot of the antiviral medications that were going, you know, and it's specifically in Africa mostly. And a lot of times you're talking about women receiving these drugs when they're pregnant, so that when they give birth, their children aren't being, you know, they're not contracting HIV through birth and things along those lines, right? So this was a program that initiated under George W. Bush. I don't think anyone thinks that he was some bleeding heart liberal, right? So, you know, in the past, some of these programs, or a lot of these programs, have been bipartisan, or they, you know, started under conservative administrations. And so when we talk about U.S. interests, it's not, you know, I do think, you know, the United States, I think all of us are familiar. We were all alive. We were young, but we were all alive when the AIDS epidemic was raging in the U.S. And you know, that was a worldwide problem, but we saw benefits, right? A lot of the drugs were actually tested and made better through, you know, through different trials that actually happened in Africa, reducing the worldwide number of AIDS cases benefited the U.S. because you weren't having that disease come in and out of the U.S., and it reduced the number of victims. That's something that has had a benefit to the U.S., right? And the issue that I have is it's not like we're saying, okay, let's assess all these programs and then look where we need to cut. It's just like, let's just cut them. And like you said, Brett, maybe it's not forever, but for the people who were receiving those drugs and there's not a quick backup, that can be life and death, right? And so it's not a latte you're not buying. You're basically looking at people's lives as if it's a latte. It's not a latte. These are people's lives.
No, so I want to be clear. I am talking about the lattes because so I got the chart here for the FY23. The health section of the pie of all of our foreign aid money is 22.3%, of which of that 22.3%, 14.7% of that is for HIV AIDS, and then the other 7.7% is other health initiatives. without having the fine tooth comb to go through what all that is, I know on my cursory research, I saw that PEPFAR is wildly successful. And that would be an example of something that I would look at and say, that actually has far outstripped in benefits what we have put into it in cost, right? So that would be something that I would say, well, keep that, because that is working very well. We're receiving more return on investment.
Well, and something to note about that
like,
too, Dion, is that with PEPFAR, it's not just government funded. That is one that has a public-private relationship. So you actually have a partnership, what I'm talking about, with the private sector and faith-based partnerships that you can go into. Those kind of things are great because it gets the public more involved with things, and it's not solely on the government.
But my issue is the way that the government, our government, is going about it so far has been stop everything. And then, like with PEPFAR, that was one that was like, stop it. We're not doing this anymore. And it's a woke Marxist left, all that language is attached to it. And then it seems like once people go, wait a minute, did you look to see what this program is, what it does? And then there's some consideration of, well, maybe let's look at, maybe we won't, and what I don't, what upsets me is that's not efficient in itself. I think, before we started recording, it quite often creates more problems to just go in with like a bull in a china shop and wreck everything and then say, we'll fix what we want to keep. That in itself is problematic. And then when you're talking about humanitarian programs where people's lives are at stake, then, I'm looking at it like, well, then who are we? Right? Like, again, who do we want to be? We just want to be a country that we give our word, we get involved, and then without any type of transition out. Right? So let's say I agree with Brett. There are things that we could bring in more private partnerships. There's things that we could pull ourselves out. I think months ago we had on one of our calls, we said, but you can't just do it overnight. But that is that's the approach we're taking, is just, well, we were doing these things, we disagree. So we're just going to drop everything. And then people have to pick up the pieces. But in the middle of that, their lives that are at stake. And that's where it just doesn't seem right.
So Dion, to your example of the getting a latte, I'm fine with that example as long as every day when you get that latte, you do the Heimlich and you save someone's life. And for us to then say, well, to solve our $2,000 budget deficit, we have to stop getting a latte, when we know that's not going to fix that, you're also sacrificing the person that you're going to do the Heimlich to every day that you go get that latte. So there is a fiscal argument, but it's just not, in the grand scheme of things, to have to sell your soul and let people die so that you can save $5 off of your $2,000 budget issue. It just, to me, that just doesn't make common sense.
I'm sorry, but this is probably one of those topics where it is extremely obvious to me, like the ideological differences between us. And I am enjoying it. I like it.
Yeah, no, I mean, but it's like, where I think we all have a similar expertise, or, it's always going to be defense, right? And we started off with Mad Dog's argument of if he had an extra dollar to spend, but we didn't unpack why he said that, right? Because a lot of times what you're talking about with prevention, right? And it's not the war you fight, it's the war you prevented, or it's the war, or it's the conflict that didn't ignite. And that's where, the more you are around the world, and this is where, we got into nation building and things that we did wrong. And I agree that that's not what we should be doing. But a lot of times it's as simple as people are fighting over resources. People are fighting because they an inability to respond to a crisis. There are other things that are going on that lead to it. It's not always ideological, right? And so sometimes, I guess and I always I think this is a pessimistic way to look at it, but I don't think we can just say that humanitarian aid doesn't have a role in security, right? And even with USAID, and I know it's a they were talking about some of the prison guards for ISIS prisons. They were being paid through USAID, right? And so people that have been rounded up and, were involved in ISIS, were involved in terrorism, where they're being held, we were helping to fund the prison guards' salaries. And so now, we spent years saying that it was in the U.S. interest just to fight terrorism. And now we're just like, I guess it doesn't matter if those people are, continue to be detained.
I know that. So I guess this is where the split is going to come between us. Is that and I want to make clear, Brett, I'm going to speak for you a little bit here, but I think I'm okay in doing it. That Brett and I, it's not that we don't care about other people, but it's that one, if our house collapses, we can no longer provide anything to anybody, either our own people or others, and two, um, the juice has to be worth the squeeze, I guess, right? Because we have limited resources, and so we have to go after the things that are going to produce the best return on investment. That's kind of what I'm saying. I do want to bring up, so I brought up in my notes, I have a graph that kind of shows U.S. foreign aid given and all the other institutions that give foreign aid around the world each year. It goes back to like 1960. Aside from like a few years during the oil crisis, where OECD countries actually gave more foreign aid than we did, it was a period of about 4 or 5 years. Other than that, since 1960, the United States has been, by and large, the largest contributor to foreign aid around the world, and it's not even close. Like, we're like double what everybody else is
We're
giving.
the biggest economy in the world.
And that's a fair point. I fine. What I'm really concerned about on this graph in particular is the last 4 years. So from 2019, we were just under 40 billion to 2023, we were at over 60 billion. And I'm
How
sitting
much
there
of that's
scratching my head
related to
going,
COVID?
yeah, but like our economy shut down as well. And our inflation was crazy and our GDP went down. And so I was like, why,
I mean, but I guess the thing is,
we were suffering at home, why were we giving all that money away to others?
and I guess so. COVID is its own. I mean, you're using an anomaly to then prove a larger point, and that's where it's hard because I mean, a lot of people have argued our economy is recovered faster than anybody else in the world as well, right? So it's a hard. So yes, it shot up in the last 4 years, but we can directly link that to a specific reason. And I don't want to have a COVID discussion because this is larger than just COVID, and we can. And I think the four of us, we know we disagree with COVID, you know what I mean? And how the government's role. And if we want to have a whole episode about COVID, I don't think we can, but I think beyond what you're looking at or what you're seeing, yeah, I think we should. What you're seeing is the response to COVID. And so that's not the norm of what our role is with humanitarian aid in quote unquote normal times. And so, yeah, it shot up in the last 4 years, but that's directly in response to a global pandemic that was unique in it as far as how it affected the world and the role that we played in it. And I think a lot of that money is tied to the vaccines and us providing vaccines, COVID vaccines. And so that money still went back to American companies. That's the government paying American companies that are developing and distributing those vaccines around the world. So that's a whole, we know about the American, the military industrial complex, but with the COVID relief, that also a version of that existed. But coming back to, go on.
No, go ahead, Tia.
I think coming back to, I guess the thing that I struggle with, so Netflix, I don't know if you guys watch Netflix. I'm a Netflix person, and I'm, the algorithm gets me every time. So today, the Surviving Black Hawk Down popped up on my Netflix feed. So I don't know what that says about what I watched. That was like the first thing, you might like this. So I watched it, and I forgot that it started off with the UN going into Somalia in 1992 because there was a famine due to the civil war, and that I didn't even remember that the issue was them trying to get food in and trying to get food to the people. And when I thought about this topic, I thought, well, are we saying in those instances, is that something we don't think the U.S. should have gotten involved in a UN mission to get food? Because, under our logic with our current administration, it seems like we would say now, no, the U.S. isn't going to give money. I'm not even going to say, the troops, but we wouldn't think that that would be something in our interest to get involved when we see people starving, halfway around the world. That's the first thing. And maybe it's the mom in me because, I'm watching the footage on that documentary and I'm seeing the little kid starving and I'm like, oh my God, and I would hope if America was going through that, other countries would say, oh, let's help, So that's where I come back to, is that who we say we want to be, as a country.
Dion, to your point, like, okay, the whole argument about like when our own house isn't in order, if it would be one thing if people had faith that if I shut down 80 billion in international aid for these things, that it would get applied to those things back home. But I don't think anyone believes that would actually happen, because simultaneously all of our domestic programs of aid are being shut down as well. So, because people will say, well, there's starving kids in America. Why are we feeding starving kids overseas when there's starving kids here? Well, there's starving kids here because our domestic programs are being shut down. And it's, no one believes that if you stop feeding the kids in Africa, you're going to start feeding them over here, because feeding kids is socialist, apparently, So that's the part, at least for me, that's one of the reasons why I'm like, it doesn't make sense to save that $5 on a latte, because you're not going to actually apply that money to something that would help.
I would go even further. Let's say we stop feeding kids in Africa, and let's say we say to the kids in America, well, your parents have the opportunity to work because you live in America and the American dream is alive and well, so you should be responsible. So we're not going to feed you either. I say that doesn't change the fact that we still have our $1 trillion deficit and nothing has changed. If those are the only cuts we're making and that's the thing we're focusing on, we have not solved or come close to solving this larger problem if it's just about the money, right? And that's where it feels disingenuous.
I'm going to I'm going to propose something here, and again, this will get other libertarians barking up my tree, but all right, if they want to comment, that's fine. But I'm going to say let's, as you wanted to do a little bit earlier in the discussion, Thea, let's move off of the money topic. So let's assume that it doesn't make a difference really fiscally whether we put this money towards it or not. So we're not considering whether we could afford it per se. Let's talk about the different types of foreign aid, and I want to kind of go through the different categories that were reported in. This comes from foreignassistance.gov is the source that I used, and let's talk about the different kinds of things that are kind of lumped into what they consider foreign aid and whether we should be doing those things, not talking about it from a cost perspective, but talking about it from a soft power. Is this the United States? Is this a country we want to be kind of thing? So the largest part of the pie is economic development, then humanitarian assistance, then health, or sorry, I got those two backwards. And then peace and security. There's multi-sector, which I'm not sure what goes into that, and program support, which I assume is just the cost of doing business. There's excuse me, democracy, human rights, and governance. There's education and social services, and there's environmental stuff. So let's take the biggest chunk there, which is economic development. Is that something that we think as a country we should be investing in? And I think we'll go to Brett for this one because it talks about money, and Republicans are the fiscally responsible ones, right?
So the Republican standpoint on this is that, we emphasize the goal that, humanitarian aid should be to help countries become self-sufficient, right? So when it comes to economic development, yes, there can be something there, but you're looking to where we are intending to foster free market principles, entrepreneurship, local developments. A good example of this, Thea, you kind of mentioned the programs under George W. Bush. Well, the Millennium Challenge Corporation was one of those, right? It's one of those that it ties aid to governance reforms and economic freedoms in the recipient countries, but that's kind of the whole point, right? Is that there's money tied to the performance that they have. They're like, we'll continue giving aid so long as there's performance that comes with it. If you stop doing these principles, you stop getting the aid. And I think that needs to be kind of part of it, because when we're providing this, we can't just leave it open-ended. the whole endless foreign aid programs, it's just not effective. Like there has to be a time frame. That's why it needs to be very targeted with how we give money and how we work with people. And that can be reviewed, of course, and it can be adjusted and changed. But I think the initial intent has to be like, hey, this will stop at a certain time. So therefore, we need you guys to kind of get your act together and work with the program. Because it's just the fiscally responsible thing to do.
Gives you sorry, Brett, kind of like a bank gives you a business loan, right? To start out, you're like, hey, the idea is that the bank will recoup its investment and then some, because you become a successful business. And so you're saying we give them essentially an economic development loan, and the intent is that they become a viable economic partner down the road.
Yeah, because if you're going to give aid to a program that continually fails to produce results, that's just not good. I mean, you need to have it where it's a time-limited, results-driven program, and you have some type of clear exit strategy that comes out of that. Because I'm okay with that.
Does that not already? I mean, the budget gets renewed every year. Like it's not like we're giving them, whatever 20 years worth of money all at once or anything. Like it gets reviewed every year. And if I agree, like these programs should be evaluated, and if they're not working, shut down. But like that's what our budget process is for. And now, granted, it's not. In general, this money is going to the World Bank, who is then like the ones distributing the money to the countries. So there's some layers of separation there, but it's still that kind of review is already happening every year.
Yeah, I guess coming back to Dion's question, as far as, okay, should we even be involved in these things? I think given, so a lot of economic development dollars go to South America, Central and South America. And right now, during this past election, we talked a lot about immigration and this crisis at the border. And, when you look at, well, where are these people coming from? What countries are they coming from? Part of the reason that we're saying that these aren't true asylum seekers is because they are coming because of economic issues in their home countries, right? Because of, these are economic refugees, for lack of a better term, and so I think the logic there is, okay, instead of then us having to spend, all this money trying to deal with a crisis on our border, then can we look to see how we can help develop these countries or help them with whatever their economic issues are so they can become more self-sufficient? And unfortunately, I just think it's not always okay, we're going to have a 5-year plan and we're in and we're out, right? And so, and then also how much, the ways in which we engage. I'm not an expert on all those countries. I was just like looking up Venezuela while we were talking to try to get an idea of like, how much money have we sent to Venezuela? How much money have we spent there? Has it worked? And the only reason I chose Venezuela is because my parents are from Trinidad and Tobago, which is 9 miles off the coast of Venezuela. And so I have a lot of family members that have strong opinions about them because of Venezuelans trying to immigrate into Trinidad. And it's one of those things where I'm like, it's so complicated, right? It's not a quick fix. Look at the aid we give to Haiti, same thing. It's not a quick fix. And so I understand where Brett's coming from is we don't want to be permanently entangled in saying, okay, we're propping up these countries. But then at the same time, when we do nothing, or if we were to do nothing, then we are still going to be impacted by whatever economic problems are happening in those countries, because in that instance, we're seeing them flee to our borders, right? So to not at least attempt to involve ourselves, it's not like we're rid of the problem. You know what I mean? And this isn't even about the money, right? It's just saying there's an impact in the US when people flee to our borders, and it does impact us in these other ways that are not necessarily just economic.
Yeah. And I want to make sure that it's clear. I know, because I know the argument kind of goes back and forth. It almost kind of seems like the Republican and the Libertarian are totally against foreign aid. For me, that's not the case. I think foreign aid is a very valuable tool that we can use. It just needs, like any program, proper oversight, proper thought that goes into it of how we go about these things. But one of the biggest things is also transparency, that the people know what's happening and where the money is going to. That so if there is an issue, we as the people have the ability to voice a concern to it. And we're talking about like the economic growth piece of it, just from that standpoint. I look at it when my time as a program manager, right, working in that realm, like I have goals that I have to hit for my program for it to continue receiving funding. and it should
But why
be
do
the
we
same
think?
way. And I think
Why
that
do
it
we assume
is.
that? Why do we assume that doesn't exist, right? In these programs, like, I just think that this idea that we were just giving money away, or it seems like there's a perception on the right that this money is just going and it's never accounted for. It's like Will is saying, that there was no consideration as to what the money is for, how long it's supposed to be given, who it's being given to, that wasn't happening, right? I that's where I have a hard time with, given that this money is allocated by Congress, these programs are reviewed, and I'm not saying that there wasn't any issues, right? Because we know in every government program where money is being spent, that there can be issues, but it just seems like the answer now is, well, then we shouldn't do any of it, and that's where I'm getting stuck. This all
Yeah,
or
and again,
nothing.
Tia, that's not what I'm saying from that standpoint. And in terms of whether it is or it isn't, I'm not saying either way. I don't have insight on every single program that's out there to know how it was run. I haven't looked at the metrics. I can't say that. I'm just voicing my opinion on how I believe that it should be done. If it's being done that way, fantastic. If it's not being done, I go back to my statements before. It's like, it's not a right or wrong thing. It's a matter of like, can it be more efficient? Right. And if it's working efficiently, great. But you can always ask yourself, can we be more efficient? Right? Because
I guess
to
I
like your
guess
point,
then
like
the question
I say,
I
like
guess
I'm
my
with you on
question
the
is then,
humanitarian side of things, where I want to
yeah,
help people. That's been one of my big
yeah.
voicing points everywhere through this, is that we need to treat each other more like neighbors. And I honestly think it goes back to the conversation we had last time, to where if we start to change the culture of the American people to be more aware of others and not so self-centered and self-centric with how we live our lives, that we start plugging into our neighbors more, that's actually going to extend greater into the broader world picture. So I think there's a lot of that, American culture that plays into how the public views how we do foreign aid.
And I guess my question, that's where it's like this. Do we agree? I think what made this a hot topic is the fact that we've seen the way the current administration has approached this problem, right? And maybe, I know, offline we've kind of started saying, okay, what how do we talk about some of the current, decisions that are being made? But I think that's what sparked it, is that, it's not, what I hear is not a desire to rebuild these programs or to make them more efficient. It's a desire to eliminate them and move on, right? I forget what the language of the tweet that Elon Musk sent out referring to USAID, but it was basically like RIP. So, bye, you're done. And then that's where it's like, okay, and I don't know if any of you guys have been involved in audits. I suspect, especially, Dion and Brett, you would have been involved in different audits that have gone on and with programs. I know when I was involved in audits, they didn't take a couple of days, and so I just don't get the sense that this was one of those things where the government assessed the costs, assessed what we were spending, did a full audit, and then made a cut based on data. And so it just feels like it's just like we're getting rid of these programs, and there's no, from the way the language is being said, RIP to me means we're done and we're not going back to do it at all. And that's
So
where
Thea,
it
I
troubles
have a
me.
couple of things to say to that. One is I actually had the opportunity to tour a couple of Elon Musk's facilities. I got to see his SpaceX rocket facility in El Segundo, or wherever it actually is there, and then
Hawthorne.
also his Starlink
Yeah.
facility up in Seattle, and
Yeah.
there, and also with Twitter, what everybody said is Elon Musk has this style of running his business where the way that he has been able to simplify and cut costs everywhere he's gone is he basically destroys everything, takes it down to the ground, and makes everything fight its way back in, whether it's part of the budget, whether it's part of the infrastructure, whether it's part of the actual thing. Like if you go and Google the difference between the Raptor engine version 1 versus version 3, it's an engineering just a thing of beauty, and that's basically what he did. Was he was like, okay, we're going to start from the ground up, and what are the absolute minimal basic parts that an engine needs to do this thing, and start adding them back in. So that's why this is happening. And this is where I'm very fond of saying that, the federal government has no fine tools in its toolkit. They're all very blunt instruments. And so if you need a haircut, it's going to grab the chainsaw to do that.
But Dion, that affects his own company. Like, okay, some people might get fired, or
I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying that's how he approaches things.
So when he approaches it that way with these programs, like literally people are going to die,
Yeah, no, I take your point. I'm not saying that his methods are necessarily one for one transferable from the private sector to the government. The other thing I wanted to say, sorry, let me just get this out, and then I'll let you guys chime in again. I have noticed that mainly from Democrats, but I have actually seen this from a lot of people across the political spectrum, where like once something makes its way into the government infrastructure, it is anathema to cut it. It must belong there if it exists, and cutting anything is terrible. And one of the things that I would hope, I feel like all of you are very rational, logical human beings. And I would just ask, have you taken a look at the just tremendous federal government we have and gone, well, yes, every single piece of it must be there because it's all doing valuable stuff. I think we could all agree that there is fat that can be trimmed. And I think we should take a critical look at the size of our federal government and go, does all of this really need to be here? Because some of these could be cut and we would not be worse off as a country without him. Okay,
I mean,
sorry.
my specialty, I started off, when I came in, my commission, personnel and manpower had just merged. Eventually we took on services. So manpower in the Air Force, our job was to look at, it's literally how many bodies how does the person and the mission, and how do you align them? How many bodies are required to do X mission? And we used to call them manpower studies, right? So you look and you'd see that a unit had, 10 people allocated to do, let's say you had whatever AFSCs, I'll use 14, 14 ends or whatever, right? How many 14 ends do you need to do this intel mission? And then you look at it and you say, this doesn't make sense. We've allocated 6, we probably only need 4, and then you cut 2, right? And I was always the main, when we were doing that, or you looking at a manpower study, there was almost always, you had certain things were over allocated. You didn't need to dedicate as many resources as you were. And I was always in favor of cutting, or not always, but I recognize what you're saying, Dion. There was always this pushback, right? Especially when we started cutting civilian billets, right? When you and I were both here in LA was at a time when we were really fighting hard we both worked at a place back then was called Space and Missile Center, SMC. And we were trying to cut spots at SMC, and it was like pulling teeth, and we were trying to cancel some of the contracts. It was painful. And that was just, basically to save a few $1 million. And I remember it was really hard. So I agree with you, Dion, in the idea that, yes, it's hard to cut things that the government does. It's hard to cut programs. But I guess what made me supportive was I recognized the homework we did before we just said we're getting rid of it, right? We did a lot of homework with those positions. We did the studies. We looked at, one of the things that was going on back then was we called them overhires, right? You'd have one civilian billet, but then you would hire 3 people, to do, and you would put on that same billet, and then you're constantly spending all this extra money. And the question is, well, did we need 3 people to do this mission, or we were just creating this so that we had all this overage? So those kinds of things, I agree with you, but it comes back to doing the work to assess why were we doing it, and then being clean in. So what you described with Elon Musk's way of coming about it, destroy it all and then make people fight for scrap. That's all about profits. But then again, there's a human cost to that, right? So I'm an employment lawyer in California, and I can tell you, yes, that method, he may have had certain methods with Tesla, but as an employer, his employment practices cost him hundreds of millions of dollars in jury verdicts for a lot of his unlawful employment practice. And I shouldn't say his, but the unlawful employment practices within Tesla specifically, right? And that's the government sued Tesla, and Tesla lost big. And so it's one of those things. There's a people cost that comes to that method, and the government isn't a business, right? Our mission isn't just to make money or to save money. It's still to take care of, we're supposed to be by the people, for the people. And so I do think we owe more to the American public than to just get rid of programs without assessing them and assessing why we created them in the first place. Because do we want to recreate problems that we had already addressed because we didn't look at why some of these programs existed, at least in the foreign aid aspect, right? Because I think we've all agreed that there are benefits, but right now I don't know if we know which is which. You know what I mean? Or the people making the decision to make the cuts, I don't know if they've adequately taken the time to be able to say, yes, this program, to Brett and Dion, to your point, this is something that is, got out of control, right? Let's say if we really believed that we were giving condoms to Hamas, right? Let's say that was a thing, right? And, I don't know if we've taken the time to identify that versus something that, upon assessment, we would agree that this is something that benefits the U.S. or that we, from a humanitarian perspective, believe is worth doing. I don't feel like that's how we've approached it. And I think that's where you're getting the pushback right now. But I agree with you, Dion. There's always going to be people who are going to push back. But right now, I think it's just that the bull in the China shop approach that's really gotten people up in arms.
Yeah, Dion, your point about how hard it is to cut, once the program's established, it's hard to unestablish it. Actually, in my mind, negates Brett's point about, well, just because we end it doesn't mean it can't come back later. Like once it's ended, it's going to be hard to bring things back. I think just as hard as it would be to end a program that has been going on for a certain amount of time. And I think that's what Elon and the current process that they're using is banking on, that, hey, once we cut it, like it's the reason he's saying RIP USAID is because like it's going to be extremely hard to bring some of these programs back online.
So either way, there's inertia.
Yeah.
And coming back full circle, I guess I get the impression that the attitude is these programs are not things we should be doing. That's what I'm hearing from the current administration, that we shouldn't be doing this. This is not what the U.S. should be involved in, whether it be for fiscal reasons or otherwise, and that's where I guess when you were saying, Dion, that's where some of the ideological, I do believe we should, I guess in that way, I am a bleeding heart liberal. I do believe that if we have the ability, even if it means that it impacts us, in different ways, I think if we have the ability to help people around the world, we should, especially when we can directly tie it back to our own security or, preventing famine, preventing disease from spreading, helping address the issue at the border. Because I do believe that you're not going to solve the border crisis with a wall or just by deporting people. You really have to look at what is causing people to come to our borders, right? I think we can't just do one. I think it has to be a multifaceted approach. And so the idea that we would not provide any economic development aid and expect that we're not going to continue to have a border crisis, I just don't think that's realistic.
Yeah, if it were me, I would, double, triple, quadruple the foreign aid to Southern and Central America if we wanted to solve our southern border problem. Like Thea said, I don't think the wall is going to do anything.
So I'm almost afraid to open this can of worms, given that we're at about 54 minutes here.
We'll do rapid fire.
Another large portion of the foreign aid is the 14.2% of it that goes to peace and security, which includes foreign military sales. It includes the money we've been sending to Ukraine and Israel. To your point, Will, about preventing other wars, there are a lot of people, I've heard this mainly from the right, that there are a lot of people that are saying in both cases, and actually Osama bin Laden himself in his letter to America actually said it was our support of Israel that turned them, Al Qaeda, against us. So we know that. But there are also a lot of people saying that our support of Ukraine angered Vladimir Putin, and that turned Russia against us and everything. So that section of the pie is maybe an instance where there is some division about, do our best intentions actually do what we think they're doing, or are there unintended consequences to where we've actually made the situation worse?
There's something to be said for unintended consequences. No doubt there. But it is the exact same argument that we've been using for humanitarian aid when we talk about military aid, foreign military sales, all that kind of stuff. If we were to sit back and just say, particularly back like 1949-ish, if we were to just be like, hey, Israel, you're on your own, good luck. If we were to sit back and tell Ukraine, hey, if Russia wants you, just, we're not going to get involved. Like standing up for the little guy, like protecting minorities from that kind of, being militarily overrun. I mean, that's the same. To me, it's virtually the same argument that we use for humanitarian aid, that what kind of country do we want to be? And are we willing to just sit back and let other people die just because we don't want to get involved when we have the capability? Again, unintended consequences to some actions, sure.
I think one of the things that, have we learned from history is the question. The irony with that particular, pot of money that you're describing, Dion, I don't think that we're going to apply that equally as far as what gets cut and what doesn't get cut. I highly doubt that the Trump administration is going to restrict the money that it provides to Israel anytime soon. Whereas Ukraine may be a completely different story. So I don't, that's going to be an interesting way how it shakes out. But I think in general, I look back at like the World War II of it all and say, I do fundamentally hope America is not a country that would just sit back and allow other countries to be invaded, sovereign nations to just be invaded. And that our whole argument is that you're not big enough to defend yourself, sucks to be you.
But we didn't get involved until Pearl Harbor was bombed, right?
And that's my point.
That's the point.
And that's my point. That's the point I'm making. I hope we learned from history. I don't think that
we should have gotten
earlier.
involved sooner, is what you're saying.
Yeah, that's my point. I'm saying that we learned the hard way.
First didn't work.
When I think a lesson from World War II is that I think America may have been naive to think this wasn't our conflict. We're not going to get involved. And then it escalated to the point where we ourselves were attacked, right? And what's the famous quote? First they came for, and then blah, blah, blah. And then when they came for me, there was no one left. I don't remember that. But I think when for the world, and here's one thing I think, Brett, I've heard you say, and I actually strongly feel the same. It bothers me that the world doesn't act and waits for America to act a lot of times when it comes to these types of things. And so like with Ukraine, I somewhat agree with conservatives when they argue like, why is it on America to defend Ukraine when you have all these European countries that are right there, right? Like, why are we the ones that whether Ukraine falls or succeeds is based on the U.S. support when you do have all these European and supposed allies that are right there? I think that is a discussion worth having that I don't think that the Biden administration had adequately enough. And I know Europe has its own problems, but at the same time, the idea that a sovereign country can be invaded by a larger country and we just sit back and say, well, it's not our problem. I think that's something I don't want that to be who we are, but I understand that there's a lot of geopolitics that come into play there.
And I think I think it's clear that I don't give the current administration a whole lot of credit, but to me, especially the way that they've come out, like they want Panama, they want Greenland, they want to do what Russia's doing. They think that looks strong and that is strong. And I think that not supporting Ukraine is kind of like their way of like, yeah, if you're strong enough, you should be able to take what you want because they want to take what they want.
But that's that's broaching another topic. But from the humanitarian side, I think that part of humanitarian aid is always going to have unintended or second, third order consequences every time you're talking about security aid through the purpose of security. I think that's just, it is what it is.
Yeah, I think it's a lot harder to piss people off when you're sending them rice and beans. It's a lot easier to piss one person off when you're sending the other guy bullets. And guns.
Absolutely.
So, okay, so Brett, you didn't weigh in yet on the peace and security part of the pie.
I'd say probably the biggest thing is that, yeah, we do need to support our allies, because if we don't, to Thea's point, it's like if we don't stand up for someone, eventually they come for us. And so there needs to be some level of that. But, I'm kind of the point where, yeah, there should be other people involved too. Like, we can't control the whole world. Like, yeah, we're a large country. We're the most prosperous country, but we're not the only country. Right. It's like there's more than just us that's involved in this, and more people need to kind of pitch into that. So I don't think that we should, again, as I said before, I am for foreign aid. I think it's a good idea. It just needs to be very strategic in how we apply it. The military side of things, yeah, I think we're all for it. The humanitarian side of things, I think we should do it. But I think, and me as a businessman, this is running through my head as I'm starting to think through this. I'm like, okay, what opportunities could I pull from this to start some type of business to where I could be the one to provide aid? And I think that kind of mindset versus the, how can I do something versus, well, maybe I'm just going to go, work for somebody else who does that kind of thing. I think we should inspire more of that. But I think there's a lot of opportunities for the private sector to get more involved with that side of things.
The only thing I'll throw out there, though, is you have like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, right? And they had all these partnerships with the U.S. government for a lot of this aid. So I do think a lot of those partnerships existed, but a lot of it was still facilitated through the U.S. government. So I think that the question then becomes looking into why were those partnerships? What was the government? What did they offer that private industry or the private sector couldn't? And maybe that's a focus on, like, is that something that can be rectified or changed, or, or bolstering those partnerships instead of, so that we're leaning more heavily on the private sector? I don't know. I'm not saying that the solution is just the government does it all. I also just don't think the solution is tear everything down and then make them fight for scraps, as Dion has described it.
The pessimist libertarian in me says that the government will always fight to give itself more power. And so in some of those instances, I can't rule out that the government was like, hey, look at all this stuff that Bill and Melinda are doing with their private foundation. What if we took over that instead? I'm not being
the government's got enough. They're the only organization that's large enough to write all the grant proposals to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to get their money to then apply to somewhere else. But Brett, I mean, to your point, it is certainly valid that we have probably conditioned the world that, hey, at some point the U.S. will take care of it, and that's also not going to go away overnight. That is probably I don't know how we do that, but to address that somehow, like, hey, and maybe, God, I hate giving them credit, but to, like, for Trump and Musk, maybe that's what they're like. The whole world should not trust the United States anymore, and that's their MO is, you don't know if we're going to be there or not. And
I mean, to me, it's kind of like raising kids in the sense that, if you have a parent that they always do the, like, okay, I told you to do this. I told you to do this. I told you this. And then finally they raise their voice and, like, I told you to do, and then the kid jumps up and does it. Right. It's because you've conditioned the kid to only respond to your yelling voice. Right. And so it's kind of the same thing where we've conditioned the world like, well, we don't have to do anything until America responds. Right. Oh, okay. Now we'll jump in. And so, yeah, I think we might need to recondition them a little bit.
But we don't then just push the kid out the door and close it and be like, sucks to be you, kid. Go figure it out.
I mean, there's something to be said about, shove them in the water, let them swim, right? You just have the pole hidden that they can't see it until they need it, right?
It'll die every now and then, but
Yeah,
Eagles push the eaglets out of the nest on top of a mountain, like, go fly, kid, right?
So, and I've voiced my opinion on this before to like, I don't agree with everything the current administration is doing. I may like some of the things they're doing. I'm not necessarily a fan of the methods that they're doing it. It's part of why we're having these commentaries to talk through. Again, it's like, hey, if this happens again, how can we do this differently? How can we be better? Right. To me, that's the whole point of having these conversations, is that as different as we are, different political spectrums, how can we actually get something that functions effectively, that we can get something that works and benefits as many people as possible, knowing that it will never benefit everybody.
All right. So I'm looking at the clock here, and I think it's about time that we put a bow in this. It sounds like we have a consensus that things like humanitarian aid, health related, probably economic development, that kind of thing, seems to be a no-brainer, that they are things that the United States should do. Things where we get into like foreign military sales and stuff, they can have unintended consequences. So maybe we need to be a little bit more rigorous in our analyses of those. And then at the end of the day, what we're talking about is such a small percentage of our overall budget that whether we cut it all or keep it all, it probably makes no difference. Did I summarize that well?
I think it's a pretty good wrap.
Okay. I'll get started with what's been making me happy this week, and then we'll go to Will, and then Thea, and then Brett. I guess you'll close us out. So
Sounds good.
This week, I can't remember if I mentioned it on camera or not last week, but we did have a snowstorm blow through. It actually gave us a decent amount of snow. We got about 6 or 7 inches of nice, like wet, packable snow. It was great. And then it actually got really warm the next day. So I had to do a little bit of shoveling, but it really wasn't that bad. But when your kid gets a snow day, it's pretty magical. Like it was a little bit frustrating trying to keep him from driving us nuts while we were trying to work from home. But just taking a step back from the laptop and watching the wonder on your child's face when he looks out and he sees the beautiful, pristine, untouched snow, and he knows there's no school, and he's just itching to get his stuff on and run out there and have a snowball fight with dad and everything. So that was awesome. Loved it. He was very upset that it melted so fast. His snowman melted overnight because it got really warm. But that day it was fantastic. Loved it.
Yeah, that is cool. We don't have that in Florida. Most of Florida. We did have it up in the Panhandle. We had a couple inches. So, I'd mentioned last week that I'm a candidate, and so the breaks that I get to where I don't have to call people and ask for money are really great when I don't have to be doing that. But what kind of highlighted that, we had family in town this weekend, and then starting on Wednesday, taking my daughter to a statewide STEM competition thing. So just I don't know. It's like the little things in life kind of are bringing a smile to my face before dreading the next round of call time. But yeah, hanging out with family, and then I'm about to take a trip with my daughter this week.
All right, mine's very trivial, but I'll use it. So I don't know if you guys watched the halftime show for the Super Bowl, but Kendrick Lamar had on these like flare jeans, and like all of a sudden, like my Instagram and social media like blew up with people being like, is it time? Are flare jeans back? And so I was no better. So I took that as inspiration to start. I went in my closet because I just needed to clean out my closet, and I found a good good handful of flared jeans, and then I tried them on and they fit, and I was like, yeah, it's like brand new clothes. So I'm bringing back my flared jeans, and that's making me happy. I wore them 2 days ago, and I'm walking around, I'm like, look at me. So yeah, that's so my thanks, Kendrick, right? Thank you for bringing back the jeans and giving me a reason to bust out some jeans that I thought were gone forever.
That wasn't quite the lesson I got from the Super Bowl halftime show, but that's one.
Like, are those flare jeans? What? Yes, Kendrick. Yes. So, millennials strike again.
That's funny, Thea, because I actually saw that pop up on my feed too, that people were commenting about the flare jeans. And it's like,
yes,
I was never a style guy anyway. Like, it just was never there. So I saw it. I'm like, yeah, I guess that did happen. So,
yeah.
But, well, cool. So, for me, probably the thing that has made me just not necessarily happy, but appreciative lately, healthy kids. We went through about a sickness here in the house. I think flu A kind of like ripped through the whole neighborhood. Like our schools were sending out notices, stuff like that. So just to be in this moment now where like our kids are healthy, right? And just to have that and not have sickness in the house, like that's just awesome. It's been a major blessing. So I'm just very thankful for that. Dion, you kind of mentioned the snow day thing. I can't remember if I ever told you guys or showed it to you, but we had a snow that hit a couple weeks back. I think it was mid-January. But we ended up building a almost like a slalom, not like slalom, like goodness, I'm totally blanking.
Luge.
Yes, there we go. Couldn't think of the word. All I can think is like cool runnings, right? But we basically built a luge like off of our playhouse and like down the slide and built it out and slid down. And I mean, it withstood for a couple of days, but it was pretty solid. But yeah, the kids absolutely loved it. It was great. I'll send the video over in the text chain so you guys can see it, get a kick out of it. But yeah, snow days are good. We actually got a dusting here last night. We were unexpected, like 3 inches. Woke up to that this morning, so that was fun. But it was that nice powdery, not like full powdery, but like packable snow, like just stuck to everything. So kids were having a blast. But all right, folks. Well, I think that brings us to a close for this episode. I got a chance to talk through humanitarian aid. If you guys like our conversations, right? If we're helping you to come to decisions, and if you guys like our disagreements, or whether you don't, like, subscribe, share with a friend. We definitely appreciate where you guys can get the word out, and hopefully we can help some people have some rational conversations. But with that, we'll sign off here, and we will be back next time.
Bye.